Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. I hope you enjoyed your weekend. And we are back with some shows. And we've got two more random shows before Holocaust Week starts. So this one is kind of in fitting in that it's rather a somber subject, but a bit about my own experience with today's subject. So we're talking with Sarah in a minute about her book, The Prisons of the Empire. And I, as a 52-year-old white male from Britain, grew up in the 80s and 90s, just bombarded with stuff about the Japanese prisoner of war camps. Tenko, the long-running BBC series that went on for years and years and years. Shangi, the Australian series. There was Prisoners of the Sun with Brian Brown, a film that it was constant. And as a young man, I was also friendly with quite a few Far Eastern prisoners of war, because where I'm from, East Anglia, a lot of those in Singapore went straight into prisoner of war camps. And where I was also involved with some sort of airborne veterans from Arnhem who would join together and perhaps have a few beers and share some jokes about their service. The Far Eastern prisoners of war, it was very, very sad and bitter and lots of horrible experiences being shared. And it was almost like a kind of a mutual sort of psychiatric session for these poor old guys. So I grew up with that baggage. And then there's the comics and the war films and the propaganda posters and images. So when I read Sarah's book, and I'll introduce her for me in a minute, a few weeks ago before this show, it really challenged my perceptions. And I'm really looking forward to speaking to my guest about that understanding we have of the Japanese experience. So without further ado, my guest is Sarah Kovner, a historian at Columbia, New York. So good afternoon, Sarah. How are you doing today?
Great. Thank you so much for welcoming me, Paul. It's a real honor. And I so appreciate you taking the time to read my book.
Well, I have to do a lot of shows and I get a lot of books, and some I half read, some I read all the way through, some I speed read. Yours, after about a third of the way, became something I wanted to read whether I was doing the show or not. So that's to your credit. Although, as I said, it did challenge my understanding, and I'm looking forward to speaking to you about it later. But before we do that, I'm going to have to ask you, why did you get interested in writing about this subject, and did you feel that perhaps the previous writing about it was too particular in its way of looking at it? What drew you to the subject?
Well, so first I should tell you a little bit about myself. I'm trained as a Japan historian, so I came to this through the lens of Japanese history, but also I grew up in New York City in the 1980s, and that was the time when all that we read in the newspapers was that Japan was taking over the world, that the Japanese companies were buying Rockefeller Center, the buildings in New York City. And so I decided I would go to university and learn about Japan. And so after I did that and I went to graduate school, I wrote a book about the Allied occupation of Japan. And then I went back in history. In terms of Allied prisoners of war, I also met people in Allied prisoners and also Holocaust survivors just growing up here in New York City. And so after the first book on the Allied occupation, I was in the process of researching this in the Red Cross archives in Geneva. I came across the reports that delegates wrote on the camps that they visited. And I was familiar with this American experience, an East Coast American experience, but I wanted to understand the Japanese view. How did they tell this history? I mean, after all, this is something that you mentioned. You told us about your history. It's something that's really something that, and I think it's more true perhaps in the United Kingdom and in Australia. It's a real part of public history. But I never came across that in all my studies of Japan. It's not something that's often discussed. So I wanted to talk about it from that angle.
And as with all modern studies, heavily drawn on the archives. It's you've gone into those resources in several different countries and you've looked at what was said, and that's what I was realizing reading it, that a lot of my experience was just talking to guys. It was talking to guys 50 years after the events then, and they'd all shared the horrific stories. And in a sense, they were almost competing to share the most horrific stories. And I'm not accusing anybody of exaggerating anything, but it became, no one in that environment ever said, well, actually, we had this guard who was quite nice. And actually, I don't remember in the early years, perhaps we did have more food or anything like that. It was just unrelenting, the bad experiences. And I understand that is what a lot of people endured, and your book isn't saying that those experiences didn't take place. What it's saying is it's trying to give a bigger view of it. So As with all my guests, you prepared a little bit of a PowerPoint presentation, and I'll kind of hand over to you in a minute, and then jump in with points for clarification. And if people have questions, then we will address them. But over to you, essentially.
Okay, thank you so much. As you mentioned already, one of the things that I strove to do in this book was to talk about the Allied POW experience around the world, right? Because you coming from the UK, you probably heard more about British POWs. You mentioned your personal experience I was in Australia not long after when I was around starting this book, and the experience of Australians is a very different one, right, than those that we find of American POWs. And different people had different kinds of experiences, and I wanted to try and get a sense while listening and respecting people's lived experiences and people's memories, taking a chance to go into the library, the archives, and see how the events were reported at that time simultaneously. And so how did I go about this? I started thinking about so there are tremendous numbers and locations of POWs in the Japanese Empire, and that's my first slide. Thanks so much. I couldn't even get them all on one map, but hopefully this map, and presents you with a sense of the scale, right? So we find a time that Japanese forces are fighting over thousands of miles of open ocean, from the Aleutians to the Straits of Malacca to the Marshall Islands to the Burma Road. And in the first 5 months of the war, they took prisoner hundreds of thousands of Allied servicemen and civilians from more than a dozen countries. We just spoke about 3, right? But many, many people involved in this war. Japanese commanders quickly set up hundreds of camps and civilian internment centers. When I talk about Allied POWs, those are armed forces, civilians. There are lots of people who are caught up in the struggle, and there are different laws that apply to these people, at least in principle. But what my book is trying to do is to tell the story of individual prisoners and internees within this broad context. And so you see on the side of the slide, I'm pointing at it, but it's in front of you, just to point out the number of camps, the number of internment centers, and the number of prisoners of war and civilian internees, so we know what we're talking about. So then I faced this question of which camps to write about. I mean, how do I pick the camps out of the 378? I decided to pick 4 places that I thought represented some of the varieties of experiences. And this is the Philippines, Singapore, Korea, the Korean Peninsula, part of the Japanese Empire at the time, and Japan. I focused on specific camps, their commanders, and interviewed, I was lucky enough to speak to some former guards and POWs, a Korean former guard, American POWs, and others. And you mentioned some of my research. I was able to, this is in a pre-COVID times, and I was able to visit archives in Japan, South Korea, India, Switzerland, Australia, the Netherlands, Great Britain, Ireland, India, and of course here in the United States. And there are many, I can answer more questions about that should anyone be interested. But I focused on some people that I thought could tell this story well. And I was lucky enough to find archival documents and papers about them. For example, there's an American counterintelligence officer, Carl Engelhardt, who shows up in my book. And what I found interesting about him is he spoke Japanese. This was a really rare, now lots of people speak Japanese, but this is a really rare thing in World War II. And Alan Toe is another example, Bombardier in the British Army, a Dutch serviceman, an Australian corporal. And so these are just some of the people that whose records I examined. All right, can I have the next slide, please?
You can.
Thanks. I use this slide to demonstrate. You were kind enough to share with the audience your history of speaking with and how you came to the topic of Allied POWs. More recently, in this film, it's not so recent now, but maybe people have seen it or read the story, or their children have read the adapted version. Or maybe this is an audience that's more familiar with the bridge on the River Kwai. I just bring this up that would be my preference in terms of films, but I just bring this up to again reiterate, to hammer home this point that the story of Allied POWs is familiar to many of us. I've spoken to many of these people whose lives were irreparably damaged by the losses they experienced, a future, right, and a family. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on today. This is often said, but it is true, and I think explains some of the ways in which Australians understand this history. I would never speak for all Australians, but it's important to keep in mind that more Australians died in captivity than in combat. And out of the American POWs, 1 in 3 didn't survive the war. But history is complicated, right? So we talked about, and we know, right, that allies, especially if you have a former POW in your family or you know people, that allied POWs underwent awful traumatic experiences. And I want to really stress that I would never deny that. This is such an important part of the history. But what I'm trying to do, and what I'm hoping my book answers, is until now, no one has asked why, right? So why did this happen? And that's my intervention, as we history professors say. We assume that everyone underwent the same experience everywhere, and that isn't what I found in my research. Slide, please.
And
So,
just to jump in again there, Sarah, because that's although we understand a picture, I would say, especially from a UK point of view, we've really only been presented one picture of one aspect of it. Very rarely, for example, I know you're touching on this, did we ever get the experience of civilians or, frankly, non-white prisoners of war? It was always about Tommy and Albert and Fred and Joe and the British prisoners of war for us, and then in Australia it was the same, but the Australian versions, and Americans, it was all about baton and the survivors of that. And like we often talk about on this channel, a very nationalistic approach to the experience. So the British talked and wrote about the British, and as Americans, Australians, and the Chinese, for example, which I know you cover, was another vast aspect of it. And of course, the various people from the subcontinent and India, and so. We have been presented a picture, but I don't know, and your book confirmed it, we've been presented a wide-ranging picture. We've been presented a very sort of single view of it.
Right, and I try to do my best to provide many accounts of very many people, but there's more work to be done, right? And maybe you have people in your audience who are pursuing their own history or doing historical work, and this is just an attempt to try and get out some of the voices that we might not have heard so much, and to really understand the Japanese government, what they were trying to do, and as well the international bodies, the Red Cross, folks like that. Anyway, so shall I go ahead, or?
Yeah, please. Yeah, continue.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I wanted to think about this question, right? So why the question of my book? Why did Allied POWs suffer so greatly? And I just wanted to. I don't have many word slides here, but I wanted to lay this out. Some of what I think the main ideas are. One is a complete lack of planning. Care for POWs was not a priority, and the Japanese never expected so many to surrender so quickly. And then second, bureaucratic incoherence. What I mean by this is that the Japanese, quite contrary to Germany, which we were talking about at the beginning, Paul and I were talking about a little bit, it was all improvised, right? Chains of command were so tangled that camp commanders were largely on their own. And finally here, this idea about guards. The guards were few in number, often untrained. Camp commandants were near or past retirement ages. The guards, and really what we see here is the guard units are a dumping ground for those unfit for frontline duty. Furthermore, this is something that many of you may know. Many of them were themselves colonials, right? So Koreans serving in the Japanese Imperial Army, Korean civilians. But I really want to emphasize that there was no centralized established policy of debasing and tormenting prisoners. And so to answer why specific abuses occurred in specific places, we have to dig deeper and go back to the earlier history of how Japanese treated POWs. Thank you. So in 1905, Japan defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. It goes from 1904 to 1905. And this victory really shocks the Western world. It grants Japan entry into the club of powerful nations, the places that were powerful civilized nations in the language of the time. And during that war, 80,000 Russians were taken prisoner by the Japanese. And I want to talk a little bit about how they were treated, because it's really a different way than the way that we think about Allied POWs in World War II. So the Japanese, first thing to say is that the Japanese treated Russian POWs far better than the Russians treated the Japanese POWs. We see this is obviously like a kind of a propaganda postcard, but you see these people here are celebrating a Russian festival in this image. But this isn't just this, as I said, this is an image that was a postcard, a propaganda image. But one reason that we have postcards like this is that foreign volunteers worked in Japanese hospitals and reported what they saw. So there are lots of ways that lots of sources and archival records that we can go to learn all this. So then the question for me is, how can we account for this shift in treatment of Russian prisoners to what we know was the treatment of POWs during World War II? So there are three main reasons, I think, and one is changes in warfare from 1905 until the late 30s, 1940s. Warfare becomes gradually more violent and eventually leads to this idea that we're familiar with, that being taken prisoner is something dishonorable. And this is codified in regulation in 1941. The second thing that I would point to is the publicization in the institution of Bushido, right? The way of the samurai, which is something that we hear a lot about, but I'm going to talk about it in maybe a slightly different way than you've heard about before. One thing that I think is important to think about, you can say that you must not be taken prisoner, but the military leadership in Japan wouldn't have had to threaten punishment, which they did if soldiers really believed it. And here, this is sort of the difference between a law or a regulation and how it works on the ground. So in any event, I talked about this regulation in 1941, a military code that instructed soldiers not to accept the shame of being a POW. So this is making explicit what had been implicit as early as the 19-teens. And just to reiterate what I said a little bit earlier, it seems obvious in retrospect. I mean, if you think about it, you try and put yourself in the place of a serviceman, which is, I think, really hard to do, but a useful exercise. It seems obvious, to me at least, that some servicemen would still surrender, right? But so this is really, I think of it as an attempt to establish a norm and to influence behavior. But beyond that, it had unintended consequences, such as leading officers and guards, Japanese officers and guards, to sometimes feel contempt for the POWs they captured and detained. I'm still in my second point, and there are a couple more things here, which is going in a little bit more depth to the history of Japanese military action. They're fighting in Siberia, in the Siberian intervention in the late teens. Also, I think this is kind of guerrilla fighting. And this is really, we start to see this begin to coalesce, this idea that being taken prisoner was dishonorable. In 1939, Nomonhan, which is sometimes called the Battle of Khalkhin-Gol. It's not remembered so much today, but maybe I'm sure you're familiar with it. This is like a major conflict in which 100,000 troops clashed. And when men fell in battle, sometimes comrades would abandon them on the field. And the Japanese army bureaucracy preferred to list these missing men as killed in action, right? Rather than to accept the fact that some were POWs. But it estimates that 1,000 to 4,000 Japanese were captured, most likely 3,000. And my third thing that I want to just mention is how in 1933, Japan announced its withdrawal from the League of Nations. And Japan had since the end of the 19th century, and if we look at the international history of Japan, it's a place that its government is seeking to be increasingly a part of Western civilization, if you will, right? Like Europe and Asia. And so in 1933, when they withdraw from the League of Nations, politicians' hopes of equality with the West are dashed. And it's really a death knell for internationalism. All right, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about the history there. And now I want to kind of move to my next slide and talk about what happens in the war.
I just want to jump in again, Sarah, because I do like jumping in, because and you do. I must stress, folks, Sarah's going into much more detail in her book than she will be tonight. There's lots more about this cultural change, military change in the 20s and the 30s that leads to this. But this idea we have of it's a disgrace to surrender is something that you've actually studied. And it's reminding me, it's a separate subject, but it's connected. Is when I had Guy Walters on back early in the year about the Great Escape, and that we have with Allied prisoners of war this idea that it's an officer's duty to escape. We've all been told that. When he has spent lots of time, there is no such directive in British forces. I mean, I'm talking about British forces. There is no. It is accepted that you shouldn't easily go to surrender. You should not, but there's nothing about actually trying to escape. And yet the world kind of it understands that this is a thing. And it's as what you've done with this, it's a disgrace to surrender, is look at this thing and try and examine where this thing comes from. And I find it fascinating that so many things we talk about as established fact, actually, you've got to do a bit of research into them and find out they're perhaps not what we see them, not what we see. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that some of our understandings of POWs generally are just understandings, not necessarily fact.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. I was thinking as you were speaking, it's a really interesting point. And I mean, I'm going to talk more about this later, but I wonder if that doesn't come in some part from the questionnaires that I can't speak with authority in Europe, but the questionnaires, at least that British and American and Australian servicemen were had to fill out at the end of the war, where it says, "Did you try and escape?" Right?
Yeah.
It was a question that was asked. So I don't know, and I don't know what you're.
Which is a very loaded question, isn't it? It's implying if you say no, you've somehow let people down. When I discovered that bit in your book, that was. I tried to put myself in the place of someone in 1945 looking at repatriation and thinking, did you try to escape? Is that I'd read that in a tone. I'd read that in a, did I do enough? I would start questioning whether I've been committed enough to my country. It's a very interesting question they ask. I understand why they asked it, but it's an odd way of wording it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true. And I think that one thing that to me is so interesting, this is going a little bit off the topic of my presentation, but one thing that's so interesting to me in thinking about the history of captivity is that it is so different than much of military history, right? Which is the story of, of combat, the history of combat. And really what you see in captivity is a pause, right? And so that for somebody who is entering, I imagine, and it depends on the person and all sorts of things, but when you are entering a military and you're seeking to fight a glorious war, and then instead you're held captive, as this is where I'm going, and what you responding to what you're saying, then you're forced to think very carefully when you're writing those questionnaires, the repatriation questionnaires. Yeah.
And just the idea, and I will let you go back to your presentation, of the idea that if you were a prisoner, whether it was of the Germans or the Japanese or the Russians or anybody for 4 or 5 years, you're maybe after the war meeting up with your buddies, that they're 2 or 3 ranks higher up the chain of command than you, because you've been languishing in a camp, you've not been promoted, you're not getting the same pay equivalent. Perhaps friends of yours who didn't get captured, who are just moving up the ladder. There's lots. I think your life being on, your military service being on pause as a prisoner is a very good way of describing it. I think it's like you're still in the military, you've still got a role to do, but you can't do that role. And yet, as you explained, there's still a hierarchy within the camps. They still try and, or some of them try and run on almost regimental lines, as if there is still in combat. But again, as you make clear, there is no single experience, a single way of doing it. Each camp of the 300 plus there were had a different way of operating. But anyway, I'll let you get back to your presentation.
No, that's fine. The discussion is the interesting bit, I think. But yeah, so I don't know if your viewers can see this. It's not that would be my fault for not sending you a better slide. But I put this diagram. I show this diagram to really demonstrate how the chain of command in the Japanese Imperial Army is not clear. And this is really different than, say, the German Army. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this as I go on. But so returning to where I started out, in the first 5 months of the war, Japan takes over 100,000. They take something like 100,000 allied servicemen, 100,000 civilian internees from all of these different places. And was there planning? Was there a system? Was there a protocol or a manual? And the answer is not really. The Japanese who planned this war it wasn't an emphasis, as I've already discussed. There was no one really in charge of caring for them who had any power, at least. The field commanders, the people who were actually taking the prisoners, never expected them to surrender so quickly, right? And in this diagram that you have before you, this is, oh, by the way, this comes from the U.S. National Archives, although I found versions of it everywhere. And its genesis is after the war, when the people in charge of investigating it are trying to resurrect, to figure out who was in charge and when and who they reported to. And in the Japanese government, the Japanese military, you really have two offices. One is the Prisoner of War Information Bureau, and this is a place that's set up in line with treaty obligations to create ID cards, lists of POWs, which were very insufficient, and transmit them to the international community of the Red Cross. And then its partner agency is the Prisoner of War Management Office, which is really running logistics to the extent that there were any logistics. And the same person is supposed to be in charge of both agencies. I think you want to go up a little, but the same person but he wasn't in the chain of command, and he didn't have any authority, right? And very few people working for him. So this person was really in an advisory capacity, one sending guidelines for camp commanders. And part of what makes this so difficult to understand the questions of prisoners of war for many people is that Japan was a signatory to the Geneva Convention. So on an official level, at least, there's a conception of how prisoners of war ought to be treated. So then the question is, why didn't that message get through? Your audience probably knows that Japan is signatory to what we today call the first two conventions, though not the third. But they weren't the only people not to sign it. And even you see this in the diplomatic cables, they even agreed to follow them, mutatis mutandis, meaning depending on circumstances. But the people who knew about them lacked the capacity to abide by them. And really, imperial planners never thought through, this is like a larger historical point, what resources the empire needed to expand. And this created a series of dilemmas for the military, who was unprepared with logistics or labor. And therefore, and this is my next slide, POW camps became a dumping ground for those judged. I mentioned this in the onset, but unfit for frontline service in the Imperial Japanese Army. And many guards, like this one, who's a Korean, were Korean, and others were Taiwanese, which are colonies of the Japanese Empire, and they're colonial civilian employees rather than imperial Japanese soldiers. And like many servicemen, they had probably never encountered a foreigner. They couldn't understand them. They didn't know how to deal with them, and some received rudimentary training and others didn't. And I like this picture. This comes from NIAD in the Netherlands, and which is a military archive, and it's really an archive of the history of World War II. And it's this is a Korean guard who is taking a picture to send home. You can see that there's a painted background, and this is an image that he would have sent home, just to explain what we're looking at here. So these are the employees, others of that employees, the military service, as I mentioned. And so just if we could move ahead to the next slide, I want to talk again about the logistical challenge. And this is a slide from my book. The map comes from my book. And you see the number of POWs transported. And on the right, you see the back of one Dutch prisoner's diary recording his journey from camp to camp. So this is just one. I don't expect the audience to delve deeply or to know where all of these camps are. But the point that I'm hoping to make is that look at all those different places in which this person spent the war. It's many places. And so the experience of being a prisoner of war different dramatically from person to person, but also from camp to camp. So that one person could have many different experiences. And even if you were held in the same camp as another prisoner, that camp itself was very different from moment to moment. And we're more familiar with the stories of atrocities here in the U.S., from the Philippines, in a UK or Australian audience might be more familiar with the Burma Railway. There are many, and many people suffered. And I would be remiss if I didn't, in addition to the experiences of Allied POWs, the Asian employees, the people who weren't Allied POWs who worked, or Asian captives suffered much more. I just want to mention that briefly. But
it also came up in the sidebar, Sarah. People already discussing about the treatment.
Sidebar? I can't see. You get the sidebar.
Yeah, it's hard for you as the guest to see it, but yeah, when you can after the show, you can go back and watch it all. There's a lot of interesting comments coming in there. Too many to kind of put all up on screen, but yeah, people are already talking about the experience of Chinese and indigenous people, and it's as usual, the World War II TV audience, they know their stuff, most of them. So it's good information being shared there.
Oh, I hope I'm not pitching it too low. I'm expecting a very educated audience. And thank you all for listening. I wish I could see the chat, but I'll just continue speaking and then I'll study it later. All right. So I was about to say that there's this range of experiences, and many of them are so awful and horrendous and horrid. But life in some camps in Japan and in what's now South Korea was better. And we know this by examining archival records and diaries. Prisoners like those who appear in my book traveled from camp to camp, and they provided records of their experiences in a variety of places. And so we have visual evidence, and we have I should talk a little bit about the kind of records I look at, right? So visuals, whether that's Japanese propaganda photographs, and other kinds of, or something like this is people's diaries, government and military documents, and many more kinds of things. But for now, I want to talk a little bit about the experience of in Korea, right? And that is, there's a picture on my next slide that comes from, you can see the Australian War Memorial. I have actually a high quality image somewhere, but I couldn't find it, so I just took this. Just look at that for a second. I'm going to tell you about the context, and then I'll talk a little bit more about what's going on in the photo. The camps were beyond Spartan. They lacked sufficient food and could have harsh climates. I don't know if anyone in the audience has spent the summer or the winter in what's now South Korea, but it can be, and now we have heat and that kind of thing, but it can be a very harsh climate. Even so, they still compared favorably with others. In Keijo, in Seoul, what's now Seoul, officers farmed potatoes and vegetables and raised hogs and rabbits. You see before you, I think it's daikon, Japanese radish. So there's this farming that is happening. Another thing that we think about, I mentioned this, we think about the tremendous Allied prisoners being forced to work, right? And this happened in many places in the empire. But in some places, the commanders struggled to find work for them. And this is the story that we see in two of the camps in Korea. They worked on large-scale civil engineering projects rather than building railways or this kind of thing. Was this an officer camp? So the question, this is a camp that actually one of the things people complained about is there were officers and civilians mixed, but in terms of camps in Korea, and maybe you know about this already, initially, the reason I'm saying that is initially officers were sent to Korea, to the camps, and they were set up as propaganda camps. And this is something I write about in my book, how I ask whether the fact that they're set up as propaganda camps to be shared with the International Committee for the Red Cross and countries around the world, whether the idea that they were set up that way influences the way that they're being treated. Right. And I think that initial setting up as propaganda camps did in fact influence the way they were being treated, even though no images came out after a certain point in the war. But even though there are all these officers, servicemen start coming in later in the war. And I believe this photo, I cannot say with, I don't remember 100%, but I believe this photo comes from a place when there are other servicemen. And beyond that, something I also want to talk about is it's officers and servicemen, but you also have civilians in these camps. Like, this is a very weird thing. This doesn't really happen beyond the, I should say, this is not something that we see commonly. So that, for example, in one of the camps in Korea, you have a civilian who's working for the Red Cross. That person should not be in a military camp. So that's just okay, so we see this, and then can I have the next slide, please? So even though you saw that food, and even though I said these places were not as bad as other places, there wasn't enough food, right? And we see this this is something that servicemen thought about a lot. We see this in the way that archival records from the camps show focus on shrinking male bodies. And this is from a drawing of being weighed, and you see how severely thin and malnourished these people are. And then can I have the next one, please? And then here we have an image of this is just one of several charts that records how people lost weight day after day. You do see that people are gaining weight and losing weight, and this to some extent coincides with, you see here, the Red Cross parcels arrive and bad feet not working. So I think this is a really interesting way to think about the history of life in a camp. You see the disease mentioned, and there are all sorts of other kinds of experiences that affect this particular prisoner's life. Okay, can I, and so I can talk more about any of these images later. The audience is interested.
Well, I can see we'll have some questions that, that as predicted, some people, I'll just, the kind of comments we're getting from Foxtrot Romeo there is typical of the people from my generation. My uncle's best friend's father was forced to work on the infamous bridge in the River Kwai. He hated the Japanese to his grave. And I would expect and imagine that we're going to get a lot of those comments today, and we're going to get a lot of those comments tomorrow when the video sits there online, and it's completely understandable. And this is what we're talking about. This is this long-lasting representation. But another thing about the food that your book reminded me of is also just not so much less food, but it's not food that people are used to. If you, whether you're a prisoner or not, if you're eating different food somewhere than you're used to, it's going to have an effect on your health. It's come up in other shows, for example, about the Alamo Scouts and what have you, with Lance Zedrick the other week, about how even training, they try to adapt their palates and their stomachs slowly to a supposedly specific theater food, so they would build up a tolerance. But the first few weeks, they had dysentery, they had problems. Now, they're not prisoners of war, they're just adapting to a food that they're not normally eating. And I think the same applies to some extent to these British and Australian, Canadian and American prisoners going into Japanese hands, is that the change of diet, whether it's, of course, there was less rations being given, but just the change of diet is having a huge effect. And that's not anybody being cruel. It's just they're experiencing a different type of food.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And to what's it, Foxtrot Romeo, I believe. Yeah. I think that is completely understandable, and I thank you for sharing that experience. And no doubt, I completely understand your uncle's best friend's father's. Thank you, OTD, Canadian Military History. I think this is, and I'm going to circle back to what you were saying, Paul, but I'm just going to comment briefly on this. So many of the POWs' diaries are about food. And so part of this, I think, I can just give you my interpretation, which is part of this is about the lack of food. And the excitement, and part of it is about, these are the main events of the day. And this is something that changes over time, a day that an egg would appear. Paul, thank you for bringing up that point. The food that Allied POWs were eating in Japan or in Korea was vastly different from the kinds of foods that they were used to, whether it was a little bit of rice, a seaweed broth. It was completely different. And it was often, it was the same or better than what the Japanese servicemen were eating, which doesn't make the experience of eating it any better. But I think that I think maybe this is something else that is hard to understand today. Many of us might be familiar with eating Japanese food or eating, not what the prisoners were eating, but having more kinds of experiences with different kinds of food than servicemen would have had in the 40s. Something that always surprises me is when is people who are living outside these camps complained at how good the food that the prisoners received was. It doesn't make the experience of eating it any better, but that is just a little bit of context. And
I have to say, Sarah, that's one of the things about your book, is that you kept throwing these little things of comparisons, Europe, outside the camp, other people's experiences. And it was those comments that often kind of derailed my brain when I was reading it, because I thought, oh, yeah, no. And I had to kind of go back and read that sentence 2 or 3 times, because it was great, but you kept tripping me up and reminding me that things were equally bad elsewhere. And yeah, kudos to you for doing that, because it you know, I as I said several times, I was like, yeah, of course, I didn't know that. Yeah, and yeah, so yeah, change of diet, change of everything, and the fact that the guards are having such meager rations as well is very important. And yeah, I'll let you keep on going. I just that was a bit of a kind of random thought coming out of my head then, but yeah.
Let me tell you one thing that I learned recently that was surprising to me. I gave a talk in a class in Arkansas, and I was told there that, you know, that here in the United States, we have this grave history of interning Japanese and Japanese American people. And much to my surprise, I heard that we see the same thing here in the United States. People in the United States, at least outside this camp in Arkansas, felt that the internees were getting better food than they were during the war.
Wow.
Here in the United States, where there was, you know, at least on the history that I was familiar with, and this isn't a subject I'm a particular expert on, is I've read a little bit about the German POWs, and they reported getting lots of food. So I think that's interesting. So that's just a quick note on food. And again, thanks to the OTC Canadian, I believe his name was.
Yes, Brad. His name's Brad. He runs a great YouTube channel.
Okay. All right. So so back to the image before us, this woodcut print. And I think this also is a nice lead in from what you were saying before, is that part of what made the POW experience so traumatic for Australians and Americans and British, you know, is this difference, right? The difference in food, the difference, and beyond that, there's this idea that even when conditions were more tolerable, they were being held captive by men they considered their inferiors. Wartime accounts, this is something that really stands out if you go back and and I'm sure that many of your audience has done this, but to go back and to read the wartime accounts, they show the enemies as members of an inferior race, if not another species. Here we see this woodblock print of a Korean guard and an Australian captive, and they had little experience with each other, and most of the time didn't speak each other's language. Many of the Japanese, if not all, Japanese and Korean guards had never encountered a non-Japanese speaking foreigner and thought they were being defiant when they didn't immediately follow orders, right? But at the same time, many American, Dutch, British Empire troops had never before encountered Asians as anything but colonial subjects.
Yeah.
Right? And some commanders therefore encouraged the guards to use corporal punishment because bigger, this is in the training of Korean guards at least, guards to use corporal punishment because bigger and stronger European and American soldiers would otherwise be impossible to control. But this wasn't policy. In fact, more than 80, and this was very surprising to me, more than 80 Japanese soldiers were court-martialed and punished for treating POWs. So like, on the one hand, that's a very small number. On the other hand, it's interesting that this happened at all, right?
Yeah, that there is a policy in place. I mean, that there is an infrastructure within the Japanese military for a guard to be punished for badly treated. Yes, 80 cases is a pinprick in the experience in the theater, but the fact there is in some ways it makes it worse, because if there is a process, then why wasn't that activated more often? But then that's like the idea, again, referring to the ETO, of the people always saying that if German officers refused orders, they were sent to the Russian front. Guy Walters, again, has never found any evidence of any German officer ever being sent to the Russian front for failure to do anything. It's one of those things we accept as being something that happened, and there doesn't seem to be any archival evidence of this actually taking place. So we now have, from your book, 80 cases, and maybe there were more, of Japanese guards or Korean guards, guards of Allied POWs being prosecuted, so to speak, for cruelty. So it is fascinating. These are things that, again, are challenge. I was saying it again. We're challenging my understanding of the situation.
Yeah, I mean, I would never. There's so much more for me to be learned, and I suspect there are many more sources than I found. One thing I was interested in is. Thank you for your question. Let me just finish and then I'll address this. One thing that I was interested in is this question of people who were Japanese speaking, and I would love to find some more accounts of prisoners or captives who were Japanese speaking. Now to Chris's question of did Japanese or Korean guards ever show empathy to their prisoners? I'm going to answer this with the answer is yes. I'm going to answer this with an anecdote of a former Korean guard that I met in Seoul. Now it's maybe 8 years ago. This is a guard who I went to visit him in his low income housing in the outskirts of Seoul, a big public building. And I had my series of questions that I wanted to ask him. But what he wanted to tell me was the story of how a few years prior, a former Dutch captive had come to visit him in Seoul and had written him letters. Maybe it was, he had contacted him and said how it was so important to him to thank this former guard because he spared him from having to work when the guard spared the prisoner from having to work when the prisoner had diarrhea. So there were people, that's just one example. And I'm telling you that because it's something that someone personally told me, and I've seen the archival records that back it up. But I think there are other examples beyond that. What years did these prosecutions? Is that a question about the court martials?
Yeah, the court martials.
Yeah, that's happening during the war.
Was it early war, late war? Or were the dates kind of spread from your recollection?
I think it's kind of spread, but I would have to check back in my book to make sure. Thank you for your question, Pat 61. So just to return a little bit to thinking about how the POWs and internees and guards may have experienced each other. My research has shown me that many POWs and internees held racist views and were particularly humiliated to become prisoners of the Japanese. None could survive without gaining at least some understanding of their captors. That sort of, I think, intuitively makes sense. They made distinctions between better and worse guards and camp commanders, and this is maybe going back to Chris's question here. A guard or who showed empathy, right? That would be somebody who would be better. And I think that this is something that seems unbelievable to many of us today, but also many showed empathy for the suffering of civilians outside the camps who were sometimes even worse off. And I mentioned this earlier than they were. All right, I think I'm ready for my next slide. And so now, right, we know that the war came to an end, but it was a slow end, right? And Korea, just this place that I've chosen to emphasize today, although I could have talked about many others, they remained for about a month as Allied forces tried to figure out just who the POWs were. Because remember, I mentioned this pretty early, the Prisoner of War Information Bureau, which was responsible for tracking down all of these, keeping track of all these prisoners, did not. They failed in that duty. So part of what at the end of the war, the Allies, in many cases, the American Army, U.S. military, was forced to try and figure out, first of all, where the camps were, who was in the camps, and people's nationalities and this kind of thing. And so the image you have, and that is the image on the right, that's the list of prisoners. On the left, we see the U.S. military sending supplies in, sometimes with tragic consequences with these landings. People got injured in this sort of thing. And I talk about that in my book. All right, so just quickly the next slide. And I want to just talk a little bit about how, as much as we focus on the suffering of POWs, many Japanese were also starving, right? And not just, I'm not a Europe historian, I'm trained in Japanese history, but obviously there are people who were starving in the European theater as well. And so there are incidents, and there's one I talk about in my book, where people actually try to break in to the POW camp because they thought they had more food.
Yeah, so, and that was one of those moments I had to read that twice in your book, because it was like, it just derailed my thinking. Again, a very good point about generally, particularly by 1945, there's a distinct lack of food globally now. I mean, we know about we've had some great presentation about the DP camps, displacement camps in Europe in 45, 46, and just massive logistical problems of getting the food to the camps, there being enough food, dietary requirements, different nationalities, needing different types of food, kosher, blah, 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 blah. But so that was a massive problem. Of course, India has had problems with famine and food throughout World War II. And although the USA is producing incredible amounts of food, it's back to when we get to the Pacific Campaign, it's all about logistics and distances, isn't it? And by 1945 there, whatever it is, 250,000 American personnel on islands like Saipan and Guam who have to be fed, and there's all the other occupation troops in Okinawa and Iwo Jima, and there's all the British. So as fast as food is getting out to the Pacific, it's not enough. And there's been a comment in the sidebar about Japan itself undergoing incredible food shortages in 44 and 45. So food has become a global problem, and it's interesting, again, just a reminding our viewers that you're saying that in various cases people are thinking that those inside camps are getting more food than those outside of camps, which is an extraordinary fact. But yeah, there it is.
Yeah, and I mean, like in Japan, at least, the food shortages go on after the war into the Allied occupation, such that food becomes a currency. And that's something I write about in my first book. That's just a bit of a sidebar there. But thank you for mentioning that. Now I want to talk I'm coming to the end of this, right? And so Paul and I were talking about this earlier, but I asked myself, and you might ask yourself why it is. So I've just told you there's such a variety of experiences, and I can't see the chat, but I'm sure many people are saying, well, this is maybe new, a different way of looking at this subject than one they've encountered before. So then why is it that we tend to hear the same kinds of stories about the POW experience? This isn't your personal experience. Maybe this is something like Paul that you encounter as just out of your interest, right? Or maybe it's something you heard about on the radio or on the internet or something like this. And I think there are a couple of reasons. One is how these stories were recorded. Literally, in the case of the surveys that POWs were made to complete during the repatriation process. And this is a list of questions that former POWs are asked to fill out. And it's a very structured kind of question. Now, when there's a structured kind of series of questions, you tend to get similar kinds of answers, or at least the answers follow a certain schema. So that's one thing I think about. And one is that they were asked if they had tried to escape, if during captivity they had attempted sabotage. And I think that it's understandable that they would emphasize that any such attempt would be harshly punished, right? I'm thinking of the servicemen trying to fill out this questionnaire. And I mean, there are real obstacles in trying to escape from, say, Singapore. And I know many of you know about Changi or this kind of thing. It's something else I talk about in my book. But I mean, a very difficult place to escape from. All right. And so I want to, I think, end up now on my next slide by talking a little bit about some broad conclusions that I've reached. So after doing all this research and thinking about these problems for so many years, I end up here. We think of war crimes as being intentional, committed by evil people. But some of the worst experiences can come about through poor planning. In this case, the leadership just didn't care. I want to emphasize that first, there's nothing, or I've not found any record of anything inherent to Japanese character or culture that led to the inhumane treatment of POWs. After all, if there had been, we would have seen the same. I would have expected to find the same experience in all of the camps.
Universally,
universally. And second, my book and my work really demonstrates that the Japanese government and military never made it wholesale policy to abuse POWs. Instead, and this is my third point, the horrors of captivity, and they were horrors, were due to accident, to bureaucratic incompetence, to pure logistics, and sometimes to evil people. But this is not a policy. And to me, and this is the really shocking bit to me, right? Like how senior officials gave so little thought to the management of these camps, and so much less than today's accounts assume. It's this Japanese military and government inattention to the challenge of managing POWs and lack of interest in caring for them that leads to so many of these cruel and inhumane situations. So that is about where I am. I'm going to wrap up here. Maybe we have some time for some more questions. I want to thank.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll have some questions. I mean, yeah, it's brilliant and thoroughly enjoyable in the sense of understand this information that I'm sure some people are finding a bit not just different, I think is the word there. Yeah, and it is. We are, as I started off there. In my case, there's so much baggage in my brain from my upbringing and from my understanding, and and have you had any pushback from people about your book saying, you're kind of making excuses for the Japanese and you're not, or has the feedback been good overall?
So I think I've had some pushback, but I think that I was expecting a lot of pushback. I think because of COVID, I haven't done the kind of public talks and encounters that I might have experienced. That I would expect it. I think that what this book does challenge people's ideas, and I really thank people for listening to me, and so I expect to hear it, and I do encounter it in the public talks I've given. I was on the radio in the U.S. and I heard it there. So,
I mean, it's understandable because I say it's an emotive subject, and I remember talking to some, might have even been my partner Mag about the stories I heard from these Far Eastern prisoners of war that I knew as a young man, and I said I can't even share them. I mean, I'm not even gonna articulate them. They are just so horrible. I don't even know why my brain still retains them. I don't know why my brain hasn't just got rid of them, but for some reason they stick there in some dark part of my brain. And I think what's interesting, we're in an era, I think, where we're starting to understand, or hoping we're understanding, a more multicultural view of World War II. I mean, we've done shows with Indian historians and people who are writing about history from outside of Britain, Australia, Canada, and the UK. And it's so important that we're looking at that way. And there is, and your book reminds us, this racial stereotyping that's definitely involved with the understanding of the Japanese, and the lack of language, it just makes that worse, and the height difference and the cultural differences. And I think essentially what you're doing is trying to just make us look at these ideas and these a little bit afresh. They try and eschew some of the baggage and kind of go, okay, let's look at what the data says, look at what the archives say, and try and learn from it. And I'm rambling now, but what do you think are the lessons? I mean, in understanding prisoners of war and in your process there, what conclusions can we draw about our understanding of the Japanese in World War II on a greater level, not just the POW experience?
Well, I just want to take a second to react to this idea of pushback. I think of it that way sometimes too, but also it's a bit of a dialogue. Just because this is what the archives showed me, that doesn't mean that your family's experience or the experience of people in a particular camp that I didn't cover, or it doesn't mean that that's not so. That's just, I'm just talking about what my research demonstrated.
Yeah. And we're getting comments like Barbara here was saying, about don't know if this was mentioned, but check out Australian British and Sandakan prison on Borneo, where over 2,000 marched to death. Absolutely. We know there are these horrific incidents. And yet again, I was reading the book, the conclusions last night, that the submarine law, the American submarine that sunk a prisoner ship, that was a single biggest killing of Allied prisoners of war. And that kind of has been conveniently pushed out of the narrative. It was just one of those bad things that happened in the war, bad luck, but there was tragedies happening in that theater anyway because of just the nature. And again, we've been looking, and people are aware of these Japanese v Allied experiences of tragedy and torture and murder, but are we aware of the other side of it? That's I think the questions we're getting there. And again, how have we been presented these stories? Have we been presented it as intentionally cruel? Why were they being moved? What was the purpose? There's greater questions to ask, I think, here. And if anyone has any more questions, here we go from Chad, Chris. Were there any acts of retribution by released POW? That's a very good question.
That's a good question. Let me just first say to Barbara, Sandakan is not mentioned in this book because I had to draw. I mean, I mentioned it, I think, but it's not one of the sources of study. One of the case studies, and it's just there are too many to talk about in narrative. Retribution by released POWs. That's it. I don't have an exact answer for you. It wouldn't surprise me. I know people doing research on this, but I can't point to. So I would say probably yes, but I can't point you to an archival example.
I know it happened in the ETO. I know it happened with German guards, and I don't talk about concentration camps. I'm talking about regular POW camps. There was retribution.
Yeah.
I know a particular story of a group of American prisoners of war who were on I think it was a boat leaving Odessa for the USA, and on that same boat were German POWs who were working in the kitchen, and half of them disappeared on the journey from Odessa to the USA, and they're not sure what. Well, they are sure what happened to them, but there's no actual, trace of what happened to them. Another question from Ian Carr, who often joined in. What's the education on these topics in Japan today? That's a very good one, and has it changed over the years? I guess would be a second to add to that.
Okay, so many questions. I really appreciate the opportunity to think about all these. Let's see. So I'm going to go backwards. Education on these topics in Japan today. I guess that depends. I would say that this is not something that is being pursued by the Japanese Scholarly Academy at large. The people who work on Allied POWs in Japan, it's not. People do research. In particular, there's a group that does, and whose members do outstanding archival, like kind of local history about it. One of the things that actually got me interested in it wasn't something that I had heard about. Maybe your audience is familiar with this idea of the history wars, the military comfort women, Nanjing, this kind of thing. It's not something that is talked about in those terms. And in fact, when I was talking to some of the veteran guards, Korean guards, they had this idea that it would soon be something that would appear in the textbooks, but I have seen no evidence of that. I think there was some mention of it last year for the 75th anniversary, but it's not something that I think is really a very popular thing to study.
I think from our Australian friends, it's something that's still rather not talked about because of sort of opening up so many dark sides on both sides. Lorelei, who's a regular viewer here, she says, is it not a reality that Japanese culture at the time of World War II looked down on other ethnicities? And I'll let you answer that, but before you do, I'll say, I think every nation looked down on other ethnicities. I mean, even, for example, the 14th Army, the British 14th Army in Burma, the Indians looked down on those that were from the area that then became Pakistan. Gurkhas looked down on other people. The British looked down. Australians looked negatively at New Zealanders. I think there's always a nationalistic kind of interpretation of people around you. The French didn't like the Belgians, the Dutch. I'm laughing, but I think these failures to understand other cultures was universal. But sure, there was definitely within the Japanese military some idea of these ethnicities being looked down on, especially I'm talking about the Chinese and the indigenous people in Malaya and Burma. But wasn't that universal though? I think all of our nations are guilty of that. That would be my response. Well, I'll be interested to hear yours.
Well, I agree with that. The audience may be familiar with works of John Dower, who has looked at put together, it's an old book now, War Without Mercy, but I think it still holds up in many respects. And if we look at the ways, the kind of caricatures of Japanese at the time, I mean, I think that we can see that what you say, Paul, is true. But of course, Lorelei, you're absolutely right. But this, as you say, Paul, is something we see around the world. I want to circle back a little bit to what you were talking about some of the lessons that we don't maybe think about as often. And
yes, please do.
Just briefly with the Allied perspective on this, I was really surprised to see in my research, and I remember finding this out when I was at Kew in Britain, that the Allies bombed boats despite knowing Americans were abroad, right, in the Pacific. And maybe that's what you're responding, you were mentioning. And more than half of all POW fatalities are from Allied bombs and torpedoes. And your audience who are military historians will understand there are really good reasons for doing this. That being said, I mean, this is a loss of life that we should acknowledge and think about, I think.
Again, it's one of those things that your book did. It's saying, yes, these deaths were occurring in prison war camps, but let's not forget that equal numbers were killing from Allied bombs and from torpedoes. And it's just that, again, I'm repeating myself. It was those comments that kind of just derailed my thinking and made me realize again that I'd been presented a one-dimensional view of this experience, and just opening out my mind a little bit left and right allowed me to confront some of these things and these ideas I had. And it won't change the experience of the people that I knew as a young man. It won't make their horror. It doesn't dismiss their terrible experiences. It doesn't. These guys were broken. They spent 50 years broken by this, and and nightmares they were having, and none of that's going to go away, and none of your research is changing those experiences. But what you're just hoping to do is just invite us who actually care about understanding a bigger picture to just kind of sit back, take a deep breath, and look at the context. It's always about context. And Colin, my mate Colin, who's just down the road from me in Bayer, how much of that is down to the US rejection of the clause to recognize all races as equal in 1919?
Excellent question. I mean, I think it's hard to, I guess I would say, if I thought about that US rejection is coming from something from the kinds of ideas that Paul was talking about before, but it doesn't help. I talked about the League of Nations earlier in the presentation, and certainly this is a really important thing for the Japanese. So yeah.
But it was also part of our war effort. I mean,
exactly.
Again, folks, you've got to look back at how Allied propaganda posters produced by departments within our governments were portraying German soldiers in the First World War, Second World War, Japanese soldiers. Look at the targets. I mean, U.S. infantrymen are trained to run down with their rifles and their bayonets. It was the buck-toothed, slanty-eyed, bug-eyed Japanese evil guy. This is the image that every Allied soldier has been given for motivation, for training, for this enemy. Look at the experiences of some of the guys on Tarawa and Iwo Jima and Eugene Sledge with the old breed, those experiences they had, and the feeling among Marines that were fighting these guys of how they perceive the Japanese. And then with that on board, understand then the reverse of when Allies were captured by the Japanese and how they saw us and we saw them. And it's a complex picture that was being fed by outside influences of media and propaganda, and also just an inability to understand each other's cultures. And that as you're saying at the point of at the beginning, we understand Asian culture much better now than we did even when I was a kid. I mean, I literally remember the first Chinese restaurant opening in my town, and it was an event, and I remember that the town not having any Asian people. I remember my town having Asian people. I remember that transition. And now it's just second nature. You accept the fact there's all people there, but it's taken us a long time to get to that point. So, I think because your book's been out a couple of years now, and I know COVID has prevented you doing the lecture circuit and what have you. But have you had any more conclusions since then, or as usual, people after doing a book they have that? Oh, I wish I'd put that in there. Any kind of latest thinking that you wish you'd included, or you would include in a second edition?
Thanks for asking. It just came out last year, so I have done some of it. I think I would like to, and this is actually the next thing that I'm going to be working on. I want to understand more of the experience of internment of civilians, both in the United States and around the world. So the one thing that I encountered, and you'll know this from reading my book, is the way that the Japanese government was very concerned with what happened to Japanese American and Japanese citizens in the United States. And they, while not at all concerned about their POWs, they were interested in civilians. And in the United States, the American government, Washington, was very concerned with what happened to POWs, but not at all interested in those civilians unwise enough to stay in Asia. And I would like to understand better how this experience of internment existed in the United States, in Britain, in New Zealand, where there was and in Australia, and to see if I can understand anything, come to more conclusions through that. And and just even what the word internment means, because again, it was as we had our show with Stephanie Hinnerschitz of the week about the Japanese incarceration internment in the US, and because you have families of colonial families, British families living in places like Singapore who, I mean, the Japanese couldn't let them go home because they were home. What do? Put them on a boat? And so sometimes they're almost living in their own communities still, just with a presence of Japanese around them. And so is that incarceration? Is it internment? Are they prisoners? Is there freedom of movement? Some as your book explains, some are allowed to move out and go shopping and move about freely. Others are behind wire. And the definition of what is a prisoner of war camp, I think, is something that your book again addresses, because again, we have this idea of guard towers and barbed wire and barriers and guys with machine guns. And that isn't the case for some of the areas where
people were held by the Japanese, and yet it is the case for others. But it's a complex picture, and I think that's the understanding I'm taking away, is that I need to go and do some more investigation into this and address where my previous understanding has been sitting. So,
yeah.
Well, I think there's no more questions coming in, so I think we'll leave it at that. So I'll just remind people what we've got coming up, and I'll come back and say goodbye to you in a second. So, folks, tomorrow we have one more show before Holocaust Week starts. So that's about OSS Detachment 101 in Burma, with my guest Edith Morant, who is an incredible expert on Myanmar and lived there and traveled there. He's involved in all sorts of projects for the people of Myanmar today and has traveled the region extensively. So she's giving us the benefit of not only her knowledge of the geography and the culture and the location, but also her understanding of the OSS in World War II. So that'll be a real treat. And then Wednesday night, there's nothing. And then Thursday, we start serious subject of examining the Holocaust. And I know there's been some feedback on Twitter and what have you about a lot of the shows will be very downbeat. I mean, it is the Holocaust. There will be some uplifting stories. There'll be some story. I haven't scheduled it yet, but it's going to be a great show where a daughter of a concentration camp survivor has made friends with the grandson of an SS commander, and how they lecture the world on their experiences and what they've learned as enemy, and coming back together, understanding the Holocaust from that point of view. So there'll be some really, really good and informative shows coming up in Holocaust Week. So I know the subject matter is going to be difficult, but I urge you to stick with it, because there will be some uplifting stories amongst the horror, because we are, particularly the show with Alina about Auschwitz and Zyklon B, will be pretty horrific. But I think we can never be reminded of those things too much. As usual, the links to Sarah's books are in the description below. Check out those. I recommend you get them. The bookshop links are there below. Check us out on Patreon. Check me out on Twitter. Check Sarah out on Twitter. And I urge you to look in some other work she's done as well. But right now, it just remains me to say thank you very much, Sarah, for joining us. Did you enjoy it?
Yeah. Is it?
We're still there. It's just us now, but I'll end it in a minute. So yeah, no, did you enjoy it? You had a good time?
Yeah, it was wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, well, and I look forward to having you back again when you've done the next side, the internment side. So that'll be really good. So, folks, this is Paul Woodard for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your day. I will say goodbye and thank you for giving us your time.